Before we go any further in our search for truth in religion, we need to stop here and ask the basic question, does God exist? Because if there is no God, there is no need for religion in the first place. Hello, I'm Chris Meyer, and this is session 7 of Are We Being Deceived? Searching for Truth in Religion. Does God exist? Did God create man, or did man create God? Isn't God just a character existing in man's imagination? Yes and no. What is the imagination? Well, if we stick with good old Webster's, it defines imagination as the faculty or action of forming new ideas, or images or concepts of external objects not present to the senses. The part of the mind that imagines things. In other words, it is the home of creativity. Imagination. It allows us to see what does not yet exist, but can exist. It was his imagination that inspired Louis Pasteur to introduce pasteurization. It was through his imagination that Benjamin Franklin looked at the lightning and imagined harnessing that energy. If it hadn't been for Franklin's imagination, we'd be watching television in the dark. The imagination is the source of all ideas and is the conduit for revelation. Imagination is the engine that drives creativity and allows us to view things beyond the tangible. It allows us to enter the world of the supernatural, the mystical, and imagine what's possible, even when others try to convince us otherwise. It is the imagination that ignites the fire of discovery. It's a place where God can speak to us. So God does exist in our imagination, but God is not imaginary. This being, if it does exist, is beyond our understanding. It is impossible to see the invisible, to conceive of the inconceivable. It's only through our imagination that we can catch a very sheer glimpse of this indescribable entity. But outside of our imagination, does God actually exist? Now, I certainly understand that some of the greatest minds in history have argued this question with no convincing resolution. So why should we spend time trying to do so in one session, what more intelligent minds have not been able to do over centuries of time? Well, we're going to approach the question a little differently. Most who have argued the question of the existence of God have tried to prove more or less definitively that God exists. This is really an impossible challenge simply because if God exists, it is beyond human and beyond what humans understand. So if it is impossible to comprehend, its existence is most certainly impossible to prove. However, the question for us is it more logical and reasonable, and does it make more sense to believe that such an entity exists than to believe that it doesn't? Now, when I say the word God, I'm not referring to that character sometimes envisioned in mainstream religion that has a long white beard and resembles a member of ZZ Top. I'm talking about an entity that is beyond all human comprehension, an entity that is not in any way physical or limited by the laws of science that apply to this world. So, how will we take on this momentous task? We will attempt to use the simple method of deductive reasoning to formulate a conclusion. The method consists of stating premises or propositions, noting the logic and reason and objective evidence supporting those premises to arrive at a credible conclusion. We will attempt to make this argument as objective, of course, as possible. Again, the question is it more logical and reasonable to believe that it does exist than to believe that it doesn't? We'll start where we must start and where most everyone before us has started, at the beginning. Where did the universe come from? Stay with me here. Science tells us that the universe has not always existed, that it had a beginning. Now, there is an ancient self-evident thesis that states that nothing comes from nothing. And even though it is self-evident, it is a statement that meets the criteria of truth. It is reasonable and logical, and it conforms to reality, since we know of nothing that has ever come from nothing. But if nothing comes from nothing, and the universe did not always exist, then where did it come from? The logical explanation must be that there was something that existed from which it could come. Something that did not come from nothing because it didn't come at all. It always was. It was something that everything else has come from. It was, as some might say, the first cause. So what was this always existing thing? Was it space? Well, space is space. And if it were empty space, then it couldn't have been the cause of anything because it was empty. When scientists try to figure out the origin of the universe, they begin with a Big Bang. But if we begin there, we haven't started from the beginning, have we? Because a bang can't occur if there is nothing there to bang. So what was it? We have two possible options. They are that this non-created thing was either a non-living substance or a living substance or entity. At this point, we are somewhat limited because we are left to examine these two options restricted to what we know from this world. And if this substance, being living or non-living, existed outside of this environment that we are familiar with, it was not limited to the limitations imposed by the matter-oriented, time and space boundaries common to this world. Nor was it required to abide by our laws of nature or science. However, we are bound by those things, and we are left to evaluate this question based on what we are familiar with. So let's take these two possibilities and discuss the potential of each as the first cause of the universe. First, let's assume that it was a non-living substance. We are told that there are four states of matter that we're familiar with: gas, liquid, solid, and plasma. From our experience, we don't have any examples of these non-living substances creating anything outside of itself. That is, unless it comes in contact with something else, some other substance, it does not have any opportunity to react. Without some kind of reaction, it simply remains the substance that it is. I cannot find evidence that there is any substance that can react and create something completely different from itself with having something else with which to react. So at this time, it is illogical and unreasonable and does not comply with our reality to suggest that this first cause was a non-living substance. Okay? Let's look at the second option, that this first cause was a living organism or entity. Again, we have two options. Either it was a very basic primitive organism, or it was a highly intelligent organism. If it were a basic organism like an amoeba or some other single-cell creature, then it might be able to reproduce itself, but the result of such reproduction would simply be more of the same. In order to evolve into some more advanced organism, it would have to have an environment that would provide it with the influences necessary to cause it to evolve or become modified. Therefore, it's not logical that the first cause was some kind of primitive organism. That leaves us with the first cause being some kind of extremely intelligent, creative consciousness that had the ability to create and bring about what exists today, the universe. We know from experience that living creatures that are intelligent and creative do have the ability to produce extraordinary things. Multiply that intelligence and creativity by 1,000 times or more, and we have a possible, logical, and reasonable first cause. Now, when I say that it's more reasonable and logical that the first cause was an intelligent entity, I'm not talking about something that we are accustomed to calling a living entity. When we think of something living, most of us envision something that is physical, or at least visible. But in this case, that isn't the case. To add credibility to our premise that the first cause was a unique entity, science has now announced that they have discovered a particle of matter that was perhaps the very first matter. They call it, appropriately, the God particle. But where did this particle of matter come from? They're working on the theory that there was this energy that was moving so extremely fast that it actually created matter. That matter is the God particle. In fact, they're experimenting now with massive super colliders in an attempt to produce energy that will move fast enough to reproduce this particle. What they haven't admitted is that this energy was what existed prior to the Big Bang and was indeed the first cause of matter and of everything else that exists today. It was an enormous explosion of energy. How can we describe the Creator? The best metaphor we have is intelligent, creative energy. What else exists everywhere? What else moves the planets, makes our hearts beat, our blood flow, and our brains function? It is energy. Nothing else permeates the universe, everywhere at once, not limited by time or space. Even Jesus compared the Spirit of God to the wind. But you say, how can we understand creative intelligent energy? It's simple. We have an example in our own world. Thoughts. Ideas are not physical. They are outside of the realm of the tangible. They are not limited to time or space. They are intelligent, creative energy. Some religions profess that we are made in the image of God, and so we are. Compared to the options that are available today, this is the most logical and reasonable conclusion concerning what existed before the birth of the universe, and is the cause of everything that exists today. Now, there is a third option that we haven't discussed, and that is, if the thesis, nothing comes from nothing, is not true, and there are things that can come from nothing, that would mean that a whole slew of things might have existed from the beginning that came from nothing before the universe was born. But since we know of no situation like that in our world, such speculation is not reasonable or logical, since we can only make arguments and offer assumptions based on what we know to actually occur. So, now, even though the existence of a highly intelligent entity is the most logical conclusion, we must ask, is there any additional objective evidence that can help us validate this conclusion? There is, and we'll discuss that in the next session. If you'd like a little more information to go in a little more detail, you can get my book, Are We Being Deceived? It's available at Amazon.com in paperback and ebook, or you can order it through your local bookstore. I'll see you in the next session.